Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you would have given them your last breath, only to discover that every single moment you shared was built on lies? I'm standing here today, alive and stronger than ever, to tell you about the day that should have been the happiest of my life, but instead became the catalyst for the most terrifying and transformative journey I've ever experienced. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived something that was deliberately designed to destroy me, and in the process, I discovered that I wasn't his first victim, nor was I meant to be his last. This is the story of how the man I loved more than life itself left me standing at the altar in front of 200 guests. Not because he got cold feet, not because he found someone else, but because destroying me was always part of his plan. And this is also the story of how I made absolutely certain that he would never, ever have the power to hurt another woman again. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about betrayal or heartbreak. It's about something far more sinister. Something that lurks in the shadows of seemingly perfect relationships. Something that could be happening to someone you know right now. If you've ever felt that something was wrong in your relationship, but couldn't quite put your finger on it, if you've ever dismissed your intuition because you wanted to believe in love, then you need to hear what I have to say. My story begins on what should have been the most magical day of my existence. But to truly understand the magnitude of what happened, I need to take you back to where it all started, because the monster I fell in love with didn't show his true face until it was almost too late. 3 years before that devastating day at the altar, I met Marcus at a charity gala in downtown Manhattan. I remember the exact moment our eyes met across that crowded room, the way my heart seemed to skip several beats, the way everything else faded into insignificance. He was standing near the bar, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that highlighted his athletic build, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile absolutely devastating. When he walked over to me, I felt like I was living in one of those romantic movies where the music swells and time seems to stand still. He introduced himself with such confidence and charm, asking me about my work as a pediatric nurse with genuine interest that made me feel like I was the only person in that entire ballroom. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing, about our dreams and our childhoods, about the kind of life we wanted to build. He told me he was an investment consultant, that he traveled frequently for work, but was looking to settle down with the right person. The way he looked at me when he said that made my entire body feel warm, made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I was that right person he'd been searching for. By the end of the evening, I was completely captivated, completely under his spell, and when he asked for my number, I gave it to him without a second thought, my hand trembling slightly as I typed it into his phone. That night, lying in my bed, unable to sleep, I replayed every moment of our conversation, every glance, every smile, feeling like something significant had just begun in my life. Our courtship was like something out of a fairy tale, the kind of romance that makes your friends simultaneously envious and hopeful that such love actually exists in this world. Marcus pursued me with an intensity that felt both thrilling and overwhelming. He would send flowers to the hospital where I worked, always with handwritten notes that quoted poetry or simply said things like, "Thinking of you," or "Counting the hours until I see you again." He remembered every small detail I mentioned in passing. My favorite coffee order, the name of my childhood dog, the fact that I loved old black and white films. On our first official date, he took me to a rooftop restaurant where we watched the sunset over the city, and he told me stories about his travels to Paris and Tokyo, painting pictures with his words that made me long to see the world through his eyes. He was attentive without being suffocating, romantic without being cheesy, strong without being domineering, or at least that's what I believed at the time. He integrated himself into my life so seamlessly, meeting my parents and charming them completely, getting along with my friends, becoming the person I called first with good news or bad. My mother actually cried the first time she met him, pulling me aside in the kitchen to whisper that I'd found someone special, that she could see how much he loved me. My father, who was typically skeptical of every man I dated, actually gave Marcus his blessing before Marcus even proposed, saying he'd never seen me so happy, so full of light. My best friend Sarah, who had been protective of me since college, told me she thought Marcus was absolutely perfect for me, that she could see us growing old together. Everyone in my life believed in us, believed in him, and their validation only reinforced my own conviction that I'd found my soulmate, my forever person, the one I was meant to spend the rest of my life with. 6 months into our relationship, Marcus started talking about marriage. We were walking through Central Park on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold, when he stopped suddenly, turned to me and said that he'd never been more certain of anything in his life than he was of his love for me. He said that every moment we spent apart felt like a waste, that he wanted to wake up next to me every single morning for the rest of his life, that he wanted to build a family with me, create a home with me, grow old with me. The sincerity in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice, the way he held my hands like I was something precious and fragile, it all felt so genuine, so real, so absolutely true. When he proposed 3 months later on New Year's Eve, getting down on one knee at midnight in front of all our friends at a party we were attending, I didn't hesitate for even a second before saying yes. The ring was stunning, a vintage emerald-cut diamond that caught the light and sparkled like captured starlight, exactly the style I'd mentioned loving when we'd window shopped together weeks earlier. I remember screaming with joy, tears streaming down my face as I nodded frantically, as our friends erupted in cheers and applause, as Marcus slipped that ring onto my finger and kissed me like his life depended on it. That night felt like the beginning of everything, like all my dreams were finally coming true, like I was the luckiest woman in the entire world. We immediately started planning our wedding, and Marcus was involved in every single decision, which I found endearing and romantic. He had opinions about everything from the flowers to the venue to the band, and while some of my friends joked that most grooms couldn't care less about wedding details, I saw it as proof of how much he cared, how invested he was in our future together. The wedding planning process took 8 months, and looking back now with clear eyes, I can see that this was when the subtle changes began. The tiny shifts that I dismissed or rationalized because I was so deeply in love and so focused on our upcoming marriage. Marcus started becoming slightly more controlling about small things, suggesting what I should wear to certain events, offering his opinion on how I styled my hair, commenting on my friendships in ways that seemed caring, but were actually isolating. He would say things like, "I just want you to look your best," or "I'm just looking out for you," or "I don't think Sarah is really a good influence on you. Have you noticed how negative she's been lately?" These comments were always delivered with such concern, such apparent love, that I never questioned his motives. I started dressing differently, seeing my friends less frequently, running my decisions by him before making them, all the while believing that this was what partnership looked like, what compromise meant. He encouraged me to take on extra shifts at the hospital, saying we needed to save money for our future, for the house we'd buy, for the children we'd have. I was working 60-hour weeks, exhausted all the time, but I told myself it was temporary, that we were building something together. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be traveling more for work, sometimes disappearing for days at a time with vague explanations about important clients and crucial meetings. When I expressed that I missed him, that I wanted more time together, he would turn it around, making me feel guilty for not being more supportive of his career, for not understanding the pressure he was under. He was so good at this, so skilled at making me question my own feelings and reactions, at making me believe that I was being unreasonable or overly emotional. Have you ever been in a relationship where you started to doubt your own perceptions, where you began to think that maybe you were the problem? If so, I want you to comment below, because what I'm about to tell you might save you from experiencing what I went through. As our wedding day approached, I was simultaneously excited and exhausted, running on very little sleep and surviving on adrenaline and coffee. The final month before the wedding was absolute chaos, with a million last-minute details to handle, and Marcus had become increasingly distant, claiming that work was overwhelming him, that he just needed to get through a few more big deals before he could fully focus on us. I tried to be understanding, tried to be patient, tried to be the supportive partner I thought he needed. My mother helped me with most of the final preparations, and I remember her commenting several times that it seemed like I was planning this wedding alone, that Marcus should be more present. I defended him every single time, making excuses about his demanding job, about how stressed he was, about how much pressure he was under. The truth is, I was making excuses for him long before the wedding. I just didn't realize it at the time. The week before our wedding, Marcus seemed off, distracted and distant, but when I asked him about it, he kissed my forehead and told me he was just nervous, that it was normal to feel overwhelmed before such a big life change, that he loved me more than anything. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The night before our wedding, according to tradition, we stayed apart. He texted me around midnight saying he couldn't wait to marry me, that tomorrow would be the start of our forever, that he was the luckiest man alive. I fell asleep with my phone clutched to my chest, those words echoing in my mind, completely unaware that everything I believed about my life, my relationship, my future, was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The morning of my wedding day, I woke up at 6 a.m., my heart racing with excitement and anticipation. My bridesmaids arrived at my hotel suite by 7, along with the hair and makeup team, and the room was filled with champagne, laughter, and the kind of joyful chaos that's supposed to accompany a bride's preparation. I remember sitting in front of the mirror as the stylist worked on my hair, watching my reflection transform, feeling like I was becoming the bride I'd always dreamed of being. My dress hung on the bathroom door, an elegant lace gown with a long train that my mother had cried over when I first tried it on. Sarah kept making jokes and trying to keep the mood light, but I could see something in her eyes that I couldn't quite identify at the time, something that looked almost like concern or worry. Around 1 p.m., we all got dressed, and when I finally put on that wedding dress, when I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I felt tears spring to my eyes because I looked exactly how I'd always imagined I would on my wedding day, beautiful and radiant and ready to marry the man I loved. My father arrived to take me to the church, and when he saw me, he actually choked up, telling me I looked just like my mother had on their wedding day, that he was so proud of the woman I'd become, that Marcus was a lucky man. The photographer captured all these moments, all these preparations, all this joy and anticipation, and those photos now sit in a box in my closet, a painful reminder of the innocence and trust that would be destroyed within hours. We arrived at the church at exactly 2:30 p.m., and I waited in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids while guests arrived and took their seats. I could hear the string quartet playing, could hear the murmur of conversation and laughter from the church, could feel my heart pounding with excitement. My mother came back to check on me around 3 p.m., 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, and she looked stressed, which I attributed to typical mother-of-the-bride nerves. She fussed with my veil, straightened my bouquet, kissed my cheek, and told me she loved me. Then she left, and I stood there with my bridesmaids, counting down the final minutes before I would walk down that aisle and become Mrs. Marcus Richardson. At 3:10, my wedding coordinator came into the bridal suite, and I immediately knew something was wrong by the expression on her face, by the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. She asked my bridesmaids to give us a moment alone, and my stomach dropped, fear suddenly replacing all that excitement. When we were alone, she sat down next to me and took my hand, and I remember thinking how strange it was that she was holding my hand, how wrong that felt. She told me as gently as she could that Marcus wasn't in the church, that he hadn't arrived, that no one had been able to reach him on his phone. I laughed because surely this was some kind of joke, some kind of mistake. There was no possible way that Marcus, my Marcus, the man who claimed to love me more than life itself, would simply not show up to our wedding. But as I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't joking. This was real. This was actually happening. My bridesmaids rushed back in, Sarah immediately wrapping her arms around me as I started to shake, as my mind tried to process information that simply didn't make sense. For the next 20 minutes, there was complete chaos as people tried desperately to reach Marcus, calling his phone over and over, getting no answer, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. His best man, David, claimed he'd dropped Marcus off at the church 2 hours earlier, that Marcus had seemed fine, maybe a little quiet, but nothing that raised any red flags. How could a grown man simply disappear from a church in the middle of the day? Where could he have gone? Why wasn't he answering his phone? I sat in that bridal suite, still in my wedding dress, my makeup starting to run as tears began to fall, refusing to believe that this was actually happening, clinging to the hope that there had been some terrible accident, that there was a reasonable explanation for his absence. My father came in, his face red with fury and concern, asking me what I wanted to do, whether I wanted him to go look for Marcus, whether we should call the police. I couldn't form words, couldn't make decisions, could barely breathe as panic started to set in. Sarah held my hand so tightly I thought my bones might break, and I could hear her whispering that everything would be okay, even though we both knew that nothing would ever be okay again. At 3:45, my mother made the decision for me, telling the wedding coordinator to inform the guests that the wedding was being postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. I couldn't face those 200 people, couldn't walk out there and admit that I'd been left at the altar like some kind of tragic cliché, like the punchline to a cruel joke. I stayed hidden in that bridal suite, listening to the confused murmurs as guests began to leave, imagining their whispered conversations and pitying looks, feeling shame and humiliation wash over me in waves that threatened to drown me. It wasn't until later that evening, after I'd been taken back to my hotel room, after I'd been stripped out of that wedding dress that now felt like a costume, after I'd cried until I had no tears left, that I finally got a message from Marcus. Not a phone call, not even a text message, but an email. An email. Can you imagine being left at the altar and then receiving an email from the man who was supposed to become your husband? The subject line read, "I'm sorry. and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. The message was short, cold, completely devoid of the warmth and love that had supposedly defined our relationship. He wrote that he couldn't go through with the wedding, that he'd realized he wasn't ready for marriage, that he hoped I would understand and eventually forgive him. There was no explanation, no real apology, no acknowledgement of the devastation he'd just caused. It read like a business email, formal and distant, like he was canceling a meeting rather than destroying someone's life. I read that email probably 50 times that night, searching for hidden meaning, for some sign of the man I thought I knew, for any indication that this was some kind of terrible mistake that could be fixed. But there was nothing, just those cold, impersonal words that told me absolutely nothing about why this had happened or what I'd done wrong. Sarah stayed with me that entire night, holding me as I sobbed, as I raged, as I cycled through every possible emotion a human being can experience. I called Marcus's phone probably 100 times, always getting his voicemail, leaving messages that started out begging for an explanation, and eventually devolved into incoherent crying. My parents came the next morning, my father looking like he wanted to kill someone, my mother looking like someone had killed her. The wedding that never happened became the talk of our entire social circle, and I could feel people's pity and curiosity, like physical weight pressing down on me. The days that followed were the darkest of my entire life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that I wasn't sure I was going to survive them. I called in sick to work, unable to face my colleagues, unable to function like a normal human being. I stayed in my apartment with the curtains drawn, not showering, barely eating, just existing in a fog of grief and confusion and humiliation. All our wedding gifts had to be returned, all our vendors had to be contacted, all our plans had to be unraveled, and every single one of these tasks felt like a fresh wound. My mother and Sarah handled most of it, but I still had to deal with the constant reminders of what should have been. I couldn't understand what had happened, couldn't make sense of how someone could claim to love you so deeply and then simply vanish without a real explanation. I blamed myself constantly, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed him, why I hadn't been enough. I stopped sleeping properly, haunted by nightmares where I was standing at that altar over and over again, waiting for a groom who would never arrive. I stopped eating much, my appetite completely gone, and I lost probably 15 pounds in those first few weeks. My friends were worried about me. My parents were worried about me. Even my therapist, whom I'd started seeing immediately after the wedding disaster, was worried about me. But I couldn't seem to pull myself out of this darkness, couldn't seem to find any reason to keep going. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with my entire future, had used me in some way I couldn't yet comprehend, and the not knowing why was almost worse than the abandonment itself. About 3 weeks after the wedding that never was, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note that said simply, "I thought you should know the truth about Marcus. I'm sorry this happened to you too." My hands trembled as I held that flash drive, as I stared at those words, as my mind tried to process what "too" meant. I immediately called Sarah and asked her to come over because I was too terrified to look at whatever was on that drive by myself. When she arrived, we sat together on my couch, my laptop between us, and I inserted the flash drive with a sense of dread settling deep in my stomach. What we found on that drive changed everything, transformed my grief and confusion into something entirely different, something far more terrifying. The drive contained documents, photographs, newspaper articles, and personal testimonies about Marcus, except his name wasn't actually Marcus Richardson. His real name was Michael Reynolds, and he was a con artist who had been running the same scam for at least 10 years. The documents detailed 3 other women who had been through almost identical experiences with him. Women who had fallen in love with a man who didn't really exist. Women who had planned weddings that never happened. Women who had been left devastated and confused. But it was worse than that. So much worse. Marcus, or Michael, or whatever his real name was, didn't just leave women at the altar for no reason. He was running an elaborate financial scam, using the wedding planning process to gain access to his victims' money, their credit, their financial information. Over the months of our relationship and engagement, he had slowly and methodically positioned himself to drain bank accounts, open credit cards in his victims' names, take out loans using their information as collateral. The wedding was never going to happen because the wedding was never the point. The point was to get as close as possible to someone, to gain their complete trust, to access their resources, and then to disappear right before any legal marriage could complicate his escape. As Sarah and I read through these documents, as we looked at photos of other women standing in wedding dresses looking exactly as devastated as I felt, as we read their stories that mirrored mine in terrifying detail, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and self-blame that had been consuming me started to transform into rage, into righteous anger, into a burning determination to make sure that what happened to me, what happened to these other women, would never happen to anyone else. I wasn't just a victim of heartbreak. I was a victim of a calculated crime. And suddenly my pain had context, had meaning beyond just personal failure. I spent that entire night reading and rereading every piece of information on that flash drive, memorizing details, trying to understand the full scope of what had been done to me and to others. The woman who had sent me this package, whose name was Jennifer, included her phone number and an invitation to call her if I wanted to talk. The next morning, still running on no sleep but feeling more clear-headed than I had in weeks, I called her. Jennifer answered on the second ring, and the first thing she said was, "I'm so sorry you're part of this club now." We talked for almost 3 hours, and she told me her story, how she'd met someone named Martin Richardson 5 years earlier, how he'd swept her off her feet, how she'd planned a wedding that never happened, how she'd been left financially devastated and emotionally destroyed. She told me that it had taken her 2 years to put the pieces together, to realize that what happened to her was part of a pattern, and another year to find the other victims and compile all the evidence on that flash drive. She said she'd seen my wedding announcement in a social column and recognized Marcus's photo immediately, had tried to reach me before the wedding, but couldn't find my contact information in time. The guilt in her voice was palpable, but I told her that she'd actually saved me, that without this information, I might have spent the rest of my life blaming myself, never understanding that I'd been targeted by a professional criminal. Jennifer connected me with the other victims, women named Patricia and Samantha, and over the following weeks, we all began talking regularly, sharing our stories, comparing notes, supporting each other through our collective trauma. What emerged from these conversations was a clear picture of Marcus Michael's pattern and methodology. He targeted successful, independent women in their late 20s to early 30s, women with good credit and stable jobs, women who were at a point in their lives where they were actively looking for partnership and marriage. He was exceptionally skilled at creating false identities, at spinning elaborate stories about his work and background that were difficult to verify, at moving through different cities and social circles without leaving obvious trails. He would invest months into each relationship, playing the long game, being patient and methodical, never rushing the financial aspects until the wedding planning began and his victims were completely emotionally invested. During the engagement period, he would gradually gain access to financial information, would encourage his victims to consolidate accounts for their future together, would suggest investments or financial moves that would ultimately benefit him. The wedding itself was his exit strategy, the moment of maximum emotional devastation that would leave his victims too traumatized and humiliated to immediately pursue legal action, buying him time to disappear and reinvent himself in a new location with a new identity. We calculated that he'd stolen approximately $400,000 from the 4 of us combined, destroying our credit, leaving us with debt, and causing psychological trauma that would take years to heal from. As we talked, as we pieced together this horrifying picture, I realized that my pain was part of something much larger, that I had a responsibility not just to myself but to every woman who might become his next target. I made a decision in those weeks following the wedding disaster that would define the next chapter of my life. I decided that I was not going to be a silent victim, that I was not going to let shame and humiliation keep me from fighting back, that I was going to use every resource available to me to make sure Marcus Michael faced consequences for what he'd done. The first step was going to the police, which was more complicated than I expected. I went to my local precinct with all the documentation Jennifer had compiled, ready to file a report and start the process of bringing criminal charges against him. But the detective I spoke with, while sympathetic, explained that cases like this were incredibly difficult to prosecute because Marcus Michael had been careful never to do anything overtly illegal during our relationship. He hadn't stolen money directly from my accounts. He'd convinced me to give him access. He hadn't forged my signature on documents. He'd persuaded me to sign things willingly. The emotional manipulation and deception, while morally reprehensible, didn't necessarily constitute criminal fraud in a way that would hold up in court. The detective did take my report and said they would investigate, but he was honest with me about the likelihood of successful prosecution, especially since Marcus Michael had undoubtedly already left the state and possibly the country. I left that police station feeling frustrated and helpless, feeling like the system I'd expected to protect me was failing me, but I refused to give up. If the traditional legal system wasn't going to deliver justice, I would have to find another way. Over the next several months, I threw myself into what became a full-scale investigation and advocacy campaign. I connected with lawyers who specialized in fraud cases, with private investigators who agreed to help track Marcus Michael's movements, with journalists who were interested in telling this story. Jennifer, Patricia, Samantha, and I pooled our resources, both financial and informational, working together like our own detective agency. We created a private website documenting Marcus Michael's known aliases, his photos, his patterns of behavior, his last known locations. We reached out to wedding vendors, venues, photographers, anyone who might have records of him planning weddings that never happened. We scoured social media, looking for any trace of him, any indication of where he might resurface, and who he might be targeting next. It was exhausting, consuming, sometimes obsessive work, but it gave me purpose when I desperately needed it, gave me a reason to get out of bed each morning. My therapist was concerned that I was perhaps too focused on this mission, that I wasn't properly grieving and healing from my trauma, but I explained that this was how I was healing, that seeking justice was part of my recovery process. I went back to work at the hospital but spent every spare moment on this investigation. My friends and family were supportive but worried, especially when months passed without any significant breakthroughs, when it seemed like Marcus Michael had simply vanished into thin air like he'd done so many times before. The breakthrough came almost 6 months after my wedding day, in a way I never could have anticipated. I received a message through the website we'd created from a woman named Emma who lived in Seattle. She said she'd been dating someone named Maxwell Richardson for 4 months, that they'd just gotten engaged, and that while researching wedding venues online, she'd stumbled across our website and recognized his photo. My heart nearly stopped as I read her message, as I realized that we'd actually found him, that we'd actually intercepted him before he could destroy another life. I immediately called Emma and we talked for hours. I told her everything, showed her all the evidence, connected her with the other women, and watched as her entire worldview shifted, as she realized that the man she loved didn't exist, that she'd been targeted just like we had. But here's where the story takes a turn that I'm sure you weren't expecting. Emma wasn't just a victim who was grateful to be warned. Emma was furious and she wanted to help us catch him. She was a paralegal with connections in law enforcement, and she had an idea that was risky, but potentially brilliant. She suggested that instead of confronting Maxwell Marcus Michael and scaring him off again, she would continue the relationship, continue planning the wedding, but now with full knowledge of what he was really doing, documenting everything, gathering evidence that could actually be used against him in court. It was dangerous, emotionally taxing, and required Emma to engage in an elaborate deception of her own, but she was determined to do it, to help us finally get justice. For the next 3 months, Emma played along with Marcus Michael's game while secretly recording conversations, documenting his financial manipulations, tracking his movements, and feeding information to us and to law enforcement. She let him think he was running his usual con, let him believe she was falling for his lies, let him gain access to accounts she'd set up specifically for this purpose with help from the FBI, who had finally agreed to get involved once we had an active case and a cooperative victim. It was agonizing to watch from the sidelines, to know what Emma was going through, to worry constantly that he would figure out what was happening and disappear again or worse, harm her physically. But Emma was incredibly brave and incredibly smart, playing her role perfectly, keeping him close while we built an airtight case against him. The wedding date approached, and we all held our breath, wondering if he would follow his usual pattern and disappear at the last minute, or if having law enforcement involved would spook him into changing his approach. The plan was to arrest him the morning of the wedding, to catch him before he could run, to finally make him face consequences for what he'd done to so many women. I flew to Seattle with Jennifer, Patricia, and Samantha, all of us wanting to be there for Emma, to support her, and honestly, to see Marcus Michael taken down with our own eyes. The night before the wedding, Emma called me crying, saying she didn't know if she could go through with it, if she could face him one more time knowing everything she knew. I told her how brave she was, how grateful we all were, how many women she was potentially saving by doing this. I reminded her that she wasn't alone, that we were all there with her, that by tomorrow this would all be over and she could begin to heal. The morning of Emma's fake wedding, I woke up before dawn, my stomach in knots, my mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. We'd coordinated with the FBI agents who would be making the arrest, and they'd assured us that everything was in place, that Marcus Michael would be taken into custody before he even realized what was happening. Emma had agreed to meet him at a cafe near the wedding venue for a pre-ceremony coffee, which was unusual, but Marcus Michael, confident in his control over her, had agreed. Jennifer, Patricia, Samantha, and I positioned ourselves nearby. Not close enough to be seen, but close enough to watch as federal agents moved into place. When Marcus Michael walked into that cafe, looking handsome and confident in a tailored suit, clearly ready to play his role one last time before disappearing with Emma's money, I felt a surge of emotions so intense I thought I might faint. Rage, vindication, fear, triumph, all swirling together as I watched the man who had destroyed my life, who had left me standing at an altar, who had made me question everything about myself, walking calmly into a trap he had no idea was waiting for him. Emma was already seated at a table, and I could see even from a distance that she was trembling, that maintaining her composure was taking everything she had. Marcus Michael sat down across from her, leaned in to kiss her cheek, started saying something that made her smile, and for just a moment, I felt a flash of the old pain, remembering how charming he could be, how believable, how good he was at making you feel like you were the center of his universe. And then the FBI agents moved in, approaching the table quickly and professionally, identifying themselves and telling Marcus Michael he was under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and a list of other charges that had been building over months of investigation. Have you ever seen someone's mask slip completely? Seen the exact moment when a person's carefully constructed facade shatters? Comment below if you've ever witnessed something like that, because what I saw in Marcus Michael's face in that moment was something I'll never forget. He tried to run at first, actually jumped up from the table and tried to push past the agents, but they had him surrounded and restrained within seconds. I could see the shock and fury on his face as they handcuffed him, as Emma stood up and looked him in the eyes and told him she knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. From where I was watching, I could see his expression cycle rapidly through confusion, recognition, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. They led him out of that cafe in handcuffs, and as they passed close to where I was standing, his eyes met mine for just a second. I don't know if he recognized me. I'd changed quite a bit in the months since he'd last seen me. Lost weight and cut my hair, and probably looked harder and older than I had on what should have been my wedding day. But in that brief moment of eye contact, I wanted him to know that I'd survived what he tried to do to me, that I'd found his other victims and we'd banded together, that we were the reason he was being arrested, that we'd beaten him at his own game. I didn't say anything, didn't need to, just held his gaze until the agents moved him into their vehicle and drove away. When he was gone, I started crying. Not sad tears, but something else entirely. A release of all the tension and rage and determination I'd been carrying for so many months. Emma came over to where we were standing, and we all hugged her, all thanked her, all told her how brave she was. She was shaking and crying too, the emotional toll of the past few months finally hitting her now that it was over, now that she was safe. The legal process that followed was long and complicated, involving multiple jurisdictions and numerous victims we discovered during the investigation who hadn't even been part of our original group. It turned out that Marcus Michael, whose real name we eventually learned was actually Derek Mitchell, had been running variations of this con for over 15 years since he was in his early 20s. There were at least 12 known victims, possibly more who never came forward out of shame or fear or simply not realizing they'd been targeted by the same person. Each of us had to give depositions, had to relive our trauma in detail for lawyers and judges, had to face Derek in court during the trial. I testified about our relationship, about the wedding that never happened, about the financial and emotional devastation his actions had caused. Looking at him across that courtroom, seeing him in a cheap suit instead of the expensive clothes he'd always worn, seeing him without the charm and confidence that had once captivated me, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. This wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with because that man had never existed. This was just a criminal who had gotten very good at pretending to be something he wasn't, at exploiting people's desire for love and connection, at using genuine human emotions as weapons. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, thanks largely to Emma's documentation and the investigation we'd all contributed to. And Derek was eventually convicted on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and theft by deception. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, which felt simultaneously like both justice and not nearly enough punishment for the lives he'd ruined, for the trust he'd destroyed, for the years of therapy so many of us would need to recover from what he'd done. After the trial, after Derek was sentenced and taken away to begin serving his time, I had to figure out how to actually rebuild my life, how to move forward from an experience that had fundamentally changed who I was. The woman who had stood in that bridal suite over a year earlier, waiting to marry a man she loved, no longer existed. I'd been transformed by trauma and by the fight for justice into someone harder, more cautious, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind a charming smile. But I'd also become stronger, more resilient, more connected to other survivors who understood what I'd been through. The five of us, Jennifer, Patricia, Samantha, Emma, and I, remained close, forming a bond that was forged in shared pain but strengthened by collective action. We started speaking publicly about our experiences, doing interviews with news outlets, working with advocacy organizations that focused on romance scams and financial fraud. We wanted to educate people about the warning signs, about the tactics these con artists use, about the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels off. We wanted other victims to know they weren't alone, that what happened to them wasn't their fault. That shame was a weapon these predators used to keep people silent. The work was cathartic and purposeful, turning our victimization into advocacy, using our stories to potentially protect others from similar fates. My personal healing was slower and more complicated than the legal resolution. I had to deal with the financial damage Derek had caused, which took years to fully repair. I had to rebuild my credit, pay off debts that weren't really mine, learn to trust my own judgment again after being so thoroughly deceived. I stayed in therapy, working through not just the trauma of what Derek did, but also the deeper questions about why I'd been vulnerable to his manipulation. What in my past or my personality had made me susceptible? My therapist helped me understand that being trusting and open-hearted wasn't a weakness, that wanting love and partnership was healthy, that what happened to me was about Derek's pathology and not about my failings. But it took a long time to really believe that, to stop blaming myself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not listening to the tiny voice of intuition I'd had at times but dismissed. Dating again seemed impossible at first. The idea of opening myself up to someone new filled me with anxiety and distrust. But slowly, very slowly, I started to heal, started to believe that not everyone was a liar, that genuine love did exist even if I'd been tricked by a counterfeit version of it. I'm not going to tell you that I'm completely healed or that I don't still have moments of anger and pain when I think about what was done to me. Trauma doesn't work that way. It doesn't just disappear because justice was served or time has passed. But I am stronger than I was, more aware of my worth, more certain that I deserved better than what Derek gave me, and more determined to build a life that isn't defined by what he took from me. Today, standing here 3 years after the wedding that never happened, I can tell you that I survived something that was designed to destroy me completely. Derek Mitchell wanted to leave me broken and ashamed and silent, but instead I found my voice. I found my strength. I found other women who shared my pain, and together we made sure he would never hurt anyone again. That feels like victory even though the scars remain, even though there are still hard days and moments of grief for the future I'd imagine that will never be. I'm not the same person I was before all of this happened. I'm someone different. Someone who knows that the world can be cruel and that people can be monsters disguised as princes, but also someone who knows the power of refusing to stay silent, of fighting back even when the odds seem impossible, of turning pain into purpose. The story I've shared with you today isn't just about heartbreak or betrayal. It's about resilience and justice and the importance of believing victims when they tell you something is wrong. It's about understanding that romance scams are real and devastating and can happen to anyone regardless of how smart or successful or careful you are. It's about recognizing that shame is what these predators count on to keep operating, and that speaking up, comparing notes, and supporting each other is how we stop them. If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, if you've been deceived or manipulated or hurt by someone you trusted, I want you to know that it wasn't your fault, that you deserve justice and healing, and that your story matters. I need to ask something of you right now. Everyone who has watched this story and stayed with me through this incredibly difficult journey. First, if this story resonated with you in any way, if you've experienced betrayal, or if you know someone who has, please comment below and share your experience or your thoughts. Your voice matters, and your story could help someone else who's suffering in silence right now. Understanding the content you've just heard is critically important because these patterns of manipulation and fraud are more common than most people realize, and education is our first line of defense against predators like Derek Mitchell. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that survivors can become warriors, please hit that like button to show your support. This kind of content needs to reach as many people as possible because somewhere out there, someone might be in a relationship like I was, might be planning a wedding to someone who's planning to destroy them, and they need to see this. They need to know the warning signs. They need to understand they're not alone. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to I Live to Tell, because this channel is dedicated to sharing real stories of survival, strength, and justice. Stories that need to be heard, stories that can save lives and change perspectives. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that could be important for you or someone you love. Every view, every like, every share helps these stories reach people who need them, helps survivors feel less alone, and helps create a community of people who refuse to let predators operate in silence. Finally, I want to leave you with this message of hope that took me years to truly believe, but that I hold on to fiercely now. What happened to you? Whatever it was, whatever pain you've endured, does not define your worth or determine your future unless you let it. You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to do with the aftermath, how you choose to rebuild, who you choose to become on the other side of trauma. For so long, I believed that Derek had destroyed me, that I would never recover from what he did, that I would never be able to trust or love or feel safe again. But here I am, not just surviving, but actually living, building a life that has meaning and purpose beyond what he tried to take from me. You have that same strength inside you, that same capacity for resilience and growth and transformation, even if you can't see it right now, even if you're in the darkest part of your journey. Keep fighting. Keep speaking up. Keep refusing to let shame silence you, because that's how we heal and that's how we ensure that the people who tried to break us don't win. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my pain and my victory, for being part of this community that believes in the power of truth and the possibility of justice. I lived to tell this story, and I'm so grateful that you were here to hear it.